Okay, great. So thank you. It is incredibly wonderful to be back to talk about this, because the ideas that I want to talk about here, I began to think about when I was here before for 4 glorious months, when my family and I got to live a stone's throw from this building and experience the story of the Icelandic constitutional struggle. And so I'm not going to talk directly about that struggle, because you know more than I do about that. But I want to talk about a deep anxiety that I think we all feel, and one solution that I don't think we're discussing enough. So the inspiration for thinking about this actually is represented in a lot of ways people talk today about the problem of democracy. But this morning, Jose said something that captured a great way to kick off. He said, they don't represent us. And what he meant by that is governments don't represent us. And that's not just true in the United States, where it's certainly true, but it's true of democracies around the world. The sense that somehow we've produced these democracies that don't represent the people. But I want you to recognize the way in which we don't represent us. Right? They are unrepresentative in obvious ways, but we are unrepresentative in non-obvious ways. So in this talk, I'm just going to point to the obvious ways that they are unrepresentative, and I want to focus my talk on the non-obvious ways that I think we are unrepresentative, because I think we need to recognize, as important as their problems are, our problems are worse. And by that I mean, I think democracy putters through with the problems that they have, but I don't think democracy survives with the problems we have unless we find a way to solve them. Okay, so I start with number 0 to be the thing I'm just pointing to. I'm going to go very quickly through this argument about why they don't represent us. It's remarked across the world that we've become polarized, and that's certainly true in the United States. When you think about we in the United States, the public, this New York Times graphic sort of captures the evolution of the median Democrat and median Republican over the last 14 years. And what that shows, obviously, is this increasing spread, but even more dramatic is the way they, representatives, have become polarized. This graphic's not very meaningful here, but what this is trying to represent is the number of times Republicans and Democrats vote together. So in 1949, you see this really intense overlapping voting. But as you look across the history of the American Republic to the modern day, we get to a world where, this is 2011, there's basically no overlapping in voting. Republicans never vote with Democrats, Democrats never vote with Republicans, and that's a dramatic shift from where it was 50 years before. So it's certainly true we are polarized, but I think actually America is bipolar. Because on the one hand, we are deeply divided, but on the other hand, we're really united. Right, so we are divided by party. Republicans and Democrats live in their tribes, and never the twain may meet. You know, it used to be they would do polls and they would ask, what if your child married a black person? And of course, people were outraged. And now people are like, I don't care if they marry a black person. But then these polls ask, what if they marry a Republican for a Democrat, or a Democrat for a Republican? And now, this is the most outrageous thing anybody can imagine. They would like disown their child if they married somebody outside the party. So we live in our tribes and we defend our tribes, and this is the sense in which we are divided. But we are united by a certain belief in America, a belief about our government, a belief that manifests itself as dissatisfaction with our government. There was a poll in the middle of 2016 that found the level of dissatisfaction with our government is the highest it has ever been in the history of modern polling. And the more interesting fact is that there is a common reason that people believe they are so dissatisfied, and they express it, to echo Jose, as they don't represent us. Question after question found dimensions of this unrepresentativeness. Corporations, they're lobbyists. have too much influence. 64% agree with that. I'm sorry, 89% agree with that. 64% strongly agree with that. And notice there's no difference between Republicans and Democrats in that poll. Or elected officials think more about the interests of their campaign donors than about the common good of the people. 89% of voters agree with that. Again, no real difference between Democrats and Republicans on that question. Big campaign donors have too much influence. 91% of Americans, 90% Republicans, 91% of Democrats. We are united in our view of how terrible this government is and the reasons it is so terrible. And the reality is these special interests that animate us so render the United States ungovernable. We've become, in the words of Francis Fukuyama, a veto-ocracy, a vetocracy, and by that he means a system where there are so many places that you can block change, that change never happens, which means those who benefit from the status quo continue to benefit. The only change that happens is tax cuts for the rich. Okay, so it's because I think we've evolved this essentially unrepresentative representative democracy. Right? A representative democracy means the system must be representative, which means it must give equal representation to the people, but our republic just does not, in any number of dimensions. So you can say, in America, do we have an equal right to vote? No, we have an unequal right to vote because of techniques used to suppress the vote of some over the votes of others. Charles Stewart at MIT estimated in the last election 16 million people had their vote denied because of these techniques. Or do we have an equal vote for the president of the United States? The answer is obviously no. In part, it's because of the Electoral College, but that's not really the core problem. The problem is states allocate their electors according to something called winner-take-all. If you get one more vote than your opponent, you get all the electors. And what that means is candidates focus just on the so-called swing states. 14 states in the United States got 99% of campaign spending in 2016. Now, those 14 states don't represent America. They are older, they are whiter, their industries are from the 19th century industry. Right, so 7.5 times the number of Americans work in solar energy as work in coal mining. But we only ever hear about coal mining in a presidential election because they are in swing states and solar energy is in non-swing states. So that means the people outside of these swing states are not represented, which means the votes of at least 52 million people are basically thrown away by this system. Or are we equal in our representation in the House of Representatives? Obviously, the Senate is unequal, but even in the House, the answer here, too, is no, because of this system of gerrymandering, which means that if you are a minority in a safe seat majority district, so a Democrat in a safe seat Republican district, or a Republican in a safe seat Democrat district, your votes never matter because the candidate knows he will never need your vote. She knows that your vote will never determine whether he or she wins. And so what that means is those votes are ignored, which in America today means 89 million Americans have no effective representation in the House. Or most dramatically, most grotesquely, are we equal as funders of campaigns? You know, America believes in private funding of public campaigns. Members of Congress spend anywhere between 30 and 70% of their time, for the kids in the room, that's a telephone here, dialing for dollars, calling people to raise the money they need, but they don't call every American. They call 100,000 Americans are funding these campaigns, which means those 100,000 have enormous power relative to everybody else, which means 139.9 million voters are inferior relative to this tiny few. And even this figure doesn't represent the tiny few. I have to cut off 4/5 of this figure to get down to the tiny few who have this influence relative to everybody else. Add this all up. And it's a pretty obvious conclusion, right? They don't represent us. This is clear, and the American people are right to believe that. Okay, but we don't represent us either. I'm going to give you 2 ideas in this talk. This is the first idea. Okay? So we, in this sense, the we in modern democracy speaks in modern democracy. Democracy thinks it hears us. And it speaks through polls. 2 kinds of polls, elections and public opinion polls. And we could go in 2 tracks in this talk, but I'm going to focus on public opinion polls here, but we could talk about elections too. And the presumption we've developed about public opinion polls is that polls represent us. And in a very scientific way, they do represent us. Done well, they are statistically representative. But the presumption here is that when they represent us, they represent our will. And that means there's a presumption that there is a will out there. And that polls are good at finding it. There's a presumption that there's a will. Let's call it the presumption of existence, or the presumption of persistence, that there is a will of the public that persists. And that what our objective in democracy should be is to go out and discover it so we can use it to steer government. And I want to convince you that's a mistake. I want to convince you that this idea that what's persisting is the public will is a fallacy. The idea that there's a will that's knowable and measurable and possessing normative significance is a mistake. I want to get you to reject this idea of the presumption of persistence. And I want to argue instead that the will of the public is kind of like Schrodinger's cat, right? The will does not exist until it is constructed, or at least in a normatively appropriate way. Until it is constructed in a normatively appropriate way, it should have no normative significance on our democracies. Say that again. Until it is constructed in a normatively significant way, it should have no influence on the decisions of our governments. Now, should is aspirational because clearly right now it does. This morning, you have this extraordinary prime minister. I have Donald Trump, but you have this extraordinary prime minister. She came here today and she told you how we're going to take a bunch of polls of the Icelandic people and ask them what they think about these questions related to the Constitution, presuming it has normative significance, what these polls tell us. Or I, in America, remember very well March 2003, where George Bush pointed to the fact that 71% of Americans believe we should go to war in Iraq as an argument for making the biggest blunder in American foreign policy history. Not that there won't be more blunders to come. It's a little bit hard now with the standard. But the point is, this normative significance is used by democracies to steer us in directions, and that's what I want to fight. It currently has normative significance. My argument is about why it shouldn't and the techniques we might adopt to change its significance and to focus when it should have upon something different. Okay, so that's the first part. Here's the second part. We should first recognize that talk about the will of the people has existed forever in the history of talk about governance and democracies. Since the beginning of the time that we spoke of democracies, people have spoken of the will of the people. And there's been a kind of dream that we can actually discover it. But almost always across the history of that discourse, when we've spoken about the will of the people, we've understood that will to be interpreted, something to be explained, to be discovered by experts and politicians, just as you might imagine the will of God being interpreted by a Catholic priest. This is actually not a Catholic priest, but I couldn't find another picture that gives this image just like that. But the point is, this priest will tell you, I've read the Latin Bible and this is what you should, this is what God wants you to do. And so you listen to this priest telling you the will of God. You have no direct way to know the will of God. But just as Martin Luther gave ordinary people an empirical way to understand the will of God, by translating these Bibles and telling them you can read the Word of God directly, there has been the same dream with the idea of the will of the people. The will of the people in a democracy could be discovered directly. So James Bryce, in this extraordinary work written in 1883, The American Commonwealth, describes, quote, a final stage in the evolution of democracy would be reached if the will of the majority of citizens were to become ascertainable at all times. He wanted to push a button and know what the people wanted. And of course, when Bryce wrote that, he spoke of the will of the people. That book is filled with him telling us what the will of the American people is on all sorts of things, but people had no way to know it. It was only interpreted. It was his dream that you could make that empirical. And it's almost 50 years to the day when it was rendered empirical. This man, George Gallup, delivered the final stage of democracy. 1935, Gallup releases his first scientific public opinion poll. And then in 1936, he causes an extraordinary stir when he predicts the winner of that election will be Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Now, that was a stir because at the time, the technique of polling that people used was the literary digest technique, which was basically to send out cards to millions of people. They got the votes of 2.5 million people about who was going to win that election. They said Alf Landon was going to beat Franklin Roosevelt by 20 points in that election. The whole world believed Franklin Roosevelt was going to be defeated in this re-election campaign. But Gallup came along and he said, no, Roosevelt's going to beat Landon, and not just by a small amount, by a large amount. This was crazy talk. And it just turned out to be the truth, because, of course, Franklin Roosevelt won the biggest landslide in the history of presidential elections, except for Washington, who didn't run against anybody. And so the idea that you could, with just a couple hundred, maybe 1,000 people, know the truth, when up to that moment people thought you had to get millions of people to answer questionnaires, radically changed the idea of the empirical access to the people, and the final stage was delivered. We had a practical way to know what the people wanted, and George Gallup went on an extraordinary writing campaign to convince democracies to turn their decisions over to the people. He said, I have no hesitation in living in a country whose everyday citizens feel about major issues as the citizens of our country feel. I'm frank to confess, I should rather trust the judgments of the majority than to trust my own individual judgment. If you say, let the people rule, you can count me on your side, so long as they are hiring George Gallup to run the polls. So this dream of Bryce was realized. We got empirical access to the people's will, and the priests and the pretenders could now be ignored. Okay, now, this critical technology of polling happens in a very important historical moment, and we're likely to miss a coincidence in that moment. Because polling is born just at the moment that broadcasting is born. Of course, in the 19th century, we had mass communications, things like the penny press. But it is the explosion of technologies of broadcasting, whether television broadcasting or radio broadcasting, that makes it such that many can hear at one time the same story. Now, that's not always wonderful. The Germans were not excited about the consequence of broadcasting, but it sometimes was wonderful. Franklin Roosevelt succeeded in knitting together the nation around the idea of defending the world against fascism through broadcasting. In 1939, 60% of people got their news from radio. By 1944, it was 74%. And then it became critical for politics always. So the election of 1960 was decided, most believe, by the television coverage of the debate, because Kennedy was a more compelling figure than the sweaty Richard Nixon. And of course, it became central to the idea of culture generally, as people began to have an outlet every night of something they could watch and be pleased to watch. This was a technology that changes how culture knows and changes how culture grows. And all this broadcast was important, but television was the most important. As Marcus Pryor, Princeton political scientist, describes in an extraordinary book, Post-Broadcast Democracy, TV changes everything. And not just because of the concentration of the networks. 1977, 90% of people get their news from 3 television networks. But also because of the addiction to the networks. Television is irresistible at the time. Like, it's a device that there's nothing better going on in the house than that device. And so people are just unable to pull themselves away, which means that when they coordinate the delivery of the news, which they did, the news happened at the same time on all 3 networks, The news was delivered to everyone. It was understandable and therefore increasingly egalitarian. More citizens became engaged in mainstream trusted sources than at any time in the history of the nation. People like Walter Cronkite created the image of what news was, a trusted father-like figure. And of course, it was only men. Developing a common understanding held in common by a people of a common set of facts. And it's on the basis of that common knowledge that political engagement changed. This is Pryor's point. This is a critical point to recognize. We knew something. Of course, not everything. I'm not saying this was a golden age in our range of knowledge. Not even every important thing. Not even everything we knew was true. But we knew something. We all knew something. And we were polled about what we knew. And thus, here's the key. When polling was born, it was born to a very special public. So if you think about stages of the American democracy, if you think of broadcast democracy in the kind of 1955 to 1985 period, and then everything else, the cacophony democracy, polling is born at the moment broadcasting democracy takes off. And it's because of broadcasting that we have a thick set of common knowledge, and that thickness of understanding produces understanding, and that thickness produces progress. And the polls report the progress. So in America, the civil rights movement is moved dramatically by television broadcast of the events in the South. Indeed, there's this one extraordinary day. I'm sure you've heard of the Bloody Sunday massacre on the Pettus Bridge, which happens on the day that America is watching Judgment at Nuremberg. So literally 80 million Americans are watching Judgment at Nuremberg, feeling good about themselves, convinced they are a great people because they fought those Nazis. And the television show is interrupted, and they show images of police officers beating people just peacefully marching across a bridge. And the psychological shock of being exposed to this extraordinary counter-narrative changes the debate dramatically. And it's because everybody is watching all of these interventions that the debate makes progress. Same thing in the context of Vietnam, a war that was deeply popular. It gets destroyed by images of the Tet Offensive, which, though technically, according to military people, was a victory, but according to America watching it, was a terrible defeat. Or the environmental movement that developed so powerfully because people get into focus on the terrible way in which the environment was being ruined. The point is, we the people seem smart as we see this progress. Smart people push the progress. The progress makes a respectable public, and a respectable public becomes a normatively significant public. Okay, so this is the happy coincidence of the 20th century. We learn how to hear the people just when the people have something smart to say. And they have something smart to say because they knew a common set of facts, and they knew a common set of facts because they had a daily education lesson for 30 minutes every night by a program intending to tell a story right down the middle, reporting the facts as quote, objective news would report. Okay, so if Gallup gave us the final stage, which was the broadcasting stage, now I want you to think about the stage after the final stage, this kind of post-broadcast stage. Because, of course, what we saw in America is until 1983, it's basically just network television. But this graph captures the dramatic change in just television. This is pre-internet. So what this graph shows you is, oops, sorry. This graph is showing you the big three television networks go from this is the black bars, this is the penetration, drops down. And then this is the cable penetration, the white bars. And then this line shows you the average number of channels per cable offering. So by the end, 100 channels are being offered to everybody. Literally 82% of Americans now have a device that gives them 100 channels. And the point is, as that happens, the consumption of television changes dramatically. Television fragments. People are no longer forced to watch the news. And cable, of course, is only the beginning. We can now extend cable to the internet, which gives many, many, many sources, leading to extraordinary fragmentation and exposure, both in culture and in democracy. And it has a dramatic effect on what people watch. Those who were forced before to watch the news, because that was the only thing on, they're not forced now. And most of them don't watch it now. And those who do watch it become the news junkies, but the news junkies are increasingly channeled into partisan outlets, so they become partisan news junkies. And that changes the business model of broadcasters. So no longer, Walter Cronkite couldn't last 2 weeks in broadcasting today. It's people like Sean Hannity, who has no connection to truth in anything he wants to say, but it's really compelling to the people who listen. These networks increasingly discover the partisan pays, and more partisan pays more, which means they have an incentive to make us stupid. Right? So think, for example, about reporting about science. We know lots of issues are partisan-related science, so global warming or GMOs. But what's interesting is not all science is partisan, in the sense that people don't react in a partisan way to all issues in science. My friend Dan Kahan has this graph. It's kind of incomprehensible like this, but basically the downward sloping lines reflect partisan reactions to those scientific issues. So global warming is a very steep curve, meaning if you're a Republican, you're less likely to think there's any problem with global warming. If you're a Democrat, you're more likely. But notice there are some of these lines that are pretty flat. So whether cell phone radiation is safe or not, there's no partisan spin on that. Okay, so you might look at that and you say, oh, that's kind of hopeful. But a marketing executive at Fox News looks at that and says, oh, here's our next market. We need to render artificial food colorings into a partisan political debate. Because if we can make it partisan, people are going to be really committed to us about artificial food colorings or radio waves or genetically modified. So the point is, there is an incentive, if it's their business to polarize, an incentive in making us stupid. Making us stupid becomes a way to make them more profitable. This is a consequence of a platform for delivering news. So, okay, summarizing, just to pull this together a little bit right now, technology enables this fragmentation. The technical fragmentation yields this economic incentive to fragment. And the point is then, if there was intelligence before, in the age of broadcast democracy, conditions have radically changed. Technical conditions have radically changed, and so those conditions have disappeared today. Now, it's not just a sad story. I mean, I think it's a great thing for culture. If you look what's on television today, at least in America, it's the best it's ever been. Game of Thrones, Better Call Saul. Francis Fukuyama writes about the end of history, but I think it's the end of culture. There's nothing better than this show. It couldn't possibly be that anything would be better than this show. So it's great for culture because of the diversity of content that's available now. Anybody can get whatever they want, and that's wonderful and amazing to celebrate that diversity. But it's terrible for knowledge. It's terrible for common knowledge, and therefore terrible for democracy. Okay, so how do you respond to this? Well, there's the anti-democracy response. People will look at the consequence of this and say, see, the people are just absurd, so ignore the people. Books like Technocracy in America, which is not really about technocracy, but the point of the argument is we need to move away from democracy as the model for organizing or setting up governments and think more about governance, like making effective governance work. And the pro-democracy response, kind of Habermas inspired, is to say, well, let's think about how we can go back to a world where we all understand enough to be sensible citizens. Now, it's my view we're not going back. This diversity of access to information is just not going back. And so then they say, well, let's educate the people better. And I don't know, I think it's only people who don't have kids who say things like that. And then the people who say, let's subsidize attention to this. So my friend Beth described this book, Bruce Ackerman and Jim Fishkin, who will be here tomorrow, have deliberation days. So we subsidize a day where everybody sits together and deliberates. But I also don't think subsidize. solves this problem. Because even if you get them to focus on a day, these are not problems solvable in a day or even understandable in a day. All of these solutions are hopeless, but importantly, they all presume that democracy needs us all. They all presume that the solution to the problem is to raise all the people, to bring us all to a place where we can be sensible Democrats, sensible citizens. They're solutions because they fix us all as we happen to be now. Okay, here's the key, the second idea that I want to give you today, for free. The second idea is thrown in. Okay? We need to give up that assumption. We need to give up the assumption that we, as we all happen to be now, is an important thing to worry about. We need to give up the assumption that it's really critical that we all understand the issues of policy enough to say sensible things about them. We need to give that up and to recognize that the we that there is always built, it's always constructed, it's always interpreted, and it must always defend how it was constructed. Okay, so I think you see this point a little bit sharply as we go back to this us versus them frame, us citizens versus them government. Their views are always constructed. They are never just found. You know, if you walked up to Justice Breyer, he's a smart justice of the Supreme Court, and you said to him, what do you think about admiralty law? Justice Breyer said, you're not allowed to quiz me about admiralty law. You want to know this question about admiralty law, get a case, write some briefs, have an argument at the court, we'll deliberate about it, we'll write an opinion. At the end of that process will be our view of admiralty law. Same thing with the president. Well, I mean, this is the exception that proves the rule. So not this president, but this president. This president never spoke off the cuff about what the presidency thinks. Like, the president recognizes that when the president says something, he is supposed to speak for the presidency. And what that means is he has millions of people as smart, or not quite as smart, but hoping to be as smart as Beth, around him, telling him what he needs to think and how he needs to think about it. He deliberates with them. And at the end of that process, he delivers the speech about what the president thinks. Same things even with members of Congress. They all have views, but their views are built. They are constructed, and they speak in a particular way, a constructed way, a way that is informed and supportive and reflective, and in that process, they get staff. So why not us? Because, of course, we have views, but our views are just found. You know, somebody calls somebody up 6 o'clock at night when they're trying to take care of the family or make dinner and say, what do you think of thorium reactors? You know, are you for thorium reactors? Or NAFTA? Should we repeal NAFTA or not? And they get answers, and those answers get recorded, and that's how we get rendered. We speak in a particular way through these systems of aggregating our views, which we all know render us in the dumbest way possible, leading us to say things like, yes, of course, we should invade Iraq. Rather than being informed, supportive, and reflective, we are not informed, supported, and reflected. We are uninformed or differently informed. And so in that, we get, and in that process, of course, we get no staff. So what do we expect? It's obviously rendered ridiculous. Process is designed to render us as ridiculous, as no other public office is. They get constructed as smart. We get constructed as ignorant. And why is that? Why do we allow that? Okay, so again, I'm claiming there is no will out there that persists. Any will is constructed, and the only question we should be asking is, can the mode of construction be justified? And so, can the prepared and informed mode for them be justified? Obviously, yes. God, if we only had a president who believed in that again, right? That would be amazing. I know he could be a Republican. I don't care. Just let him think, or her think carefully before she or he tweets. So yes, that can be justified, but can the random quiz for us be justified? The idea that we get represented by this random question asked to people who are randomly informed, the answer is obviously no. All right, so then these questions then point us in the direction of thinking about how can we construct we's that we respect. So one way to do it is might think about, regulating polls. Or at least the Europeans could think about that. The Americans could never regulate polls. But imagine polls were required to report what kind of poll they were. Not just in the sense of we randomly surveyed 500 people, but they had to reflect whether they were informed and reflective population that was polled. And if they were, they'd put like an IRP. And if they weren't, they'd say a not IRP. But the point is we can distinguish between polls that actually are polling people who know something because they've been informed of something and are representative versus polls that just take the random slop. Now, it's not like all polls need to inform people of something. The poll, who do you want to win in the World Cup? You don't need any education for that. People have self-educated, and there's no gap in understanding. But polls like, should thorium reactors be built? That is not a meaningful question unless you are talking to people who have had some opportunity to think about it. So the first thing to think about is maybe we should start discriminating among polls. But the second, I think, more important point is that we need to think about how to make us better, by which I don't mean make all of us better. I mean make some of us better by adopting a model of the public speaking that mirrors what we recognize happens with a jury. If you think about juries in America, juries are really central to America, not so much the rest of, not necessarily the rest of Europe. But juries are this extraordinary institution where we, in a really imperfectly random and not sufficiently representative, but we, in a very committed way, allocate critical decisions to a sub-public, to a mini-public. In America, they can send somebody to death, or they can allocate billions of dollars in damages. And when we do that because we expect that they will be placed into a context where they will be informed, given both sides of the argument, have a chance to deliberate, and then they will speak. And what we know is any step along that way does not earn the right to represent what the jury says. If you polled them midway through and said, what do you think now? You can't say that's what the jury believes. The jury only speaks at the end of the process. And nobody in America is troubled with this idea, or the idea that we've delegated to these mini-publics these critical decisions at different points of time. Because we've internalized the idea that we all couldn't do it together. So we got to have we doing it somehow. So why not have a we who is informed and reflective and careful do it? And, as long as it's not corrupted in some way, that will be better than the alternative. It would represent us better. And this, it seems to me, is the project. So I think, it might be because I'm proud she was my student, but I think what Beth was talking about here should be the general category that we're thinking about. Crowd law is the general category. It's the category of, it's a field that is reflecting on the different ways in which we can produce a better we. And, of course, it's different depending on the need and the particular application and the context and the constraints and the resources, no doubt. But it is the field that is thinking about what is the way to make a better we in the context of democracy. And the particular one that I'm very focused on and have been excited about for 20 years is what Jim Fishkin will talk about tomorrow, deliberative polls. Because what deliberative polls are regular scientific polls, but the people being polled are representative and informed. And as you know, the process of that informing is the critical step in making sure that people know what they're talking about as they deliberate and as they come up with some views at the end. So, for example, you came close to this in the process which eventually the council worked on to produce your draft constitution. The first stage, though one could say should have been longer, should have been more preparation, but the first stage of the 1,000 randomly selected people identifying values was the model here. But I think the really exciting example that I get to tell before Jim's here, so I'm stealing some of his thunder, happened in this place. This kind of looks Icelandic except for the animals, right? But this is Mongolia, where this is a picture. It's not a painting of like a normal person in Mongolia. So Mongolia has this amazing law that says before they can consider a constitutional amendment, it has to be passed through a deliberative poll. So Jim and I went to watch this happen last May, the first such deliberative poll in the history of the world, by law mandated deliberative poll. 700 Mongolians gathered in Ulaanbaatar. So these 700 Mongolia is the size of Western Europe. It has a population of 3 million. So half of these people had spent 2 nights in a bus to come to Ulaanbaatar. And as you might be able to see, most of the ones, especially coming in a bus for 2 nights, come in their traditional garb. This is a perfectly representative sample of Mongolia. It's slightly more women than men, but, in the scale of things, that's not a bad mistake to make, perhaps. But it's as close as they could get to representative of Mongolia. And what they did is they gave them a briefing before they came, and then they gave them the opportunity to deliberate in large groups and in small groups about these amendments to the Constitution. And so I had a translator, and I walked around and listened to their deliberations. And, not all were deliberating all the time. But the point is, this process produced something that was, for me, incredibly inspiring. Because, as a Harvard law professor who teaches constitutional law, I was convinced they would never be able to understand the subtlety of the question which they were being asked to answer. And within a day, the argument and the discussions were as serious and reflective as any could be among professors in faculty. It turns out constitutional law is not rocket science, and it shouldn't be rocket science. It's about governing the people. So the people ought to be able to reflect on it, and this was an extraordinary context where these people were not elected, but they were not ignorant. And they produced a we that we could be proud of through this pervasive effect. Now, the challenge here is, how do we make the results of these things persuasive? Because the truth is that though there have been many experiments like this, the public has not yet embraced them. So Canada all the time has things like deliberative polls that then get submitted to a referendum. Every single time they get rejected in the referendum, which means the people here's what the people thought, and then they say, hell no, we think something different. So I think we need to think about the strategies that might render sensible the alternative to the ignorant that we see in public life right now. And so one part of the strategy is to utter the obvious again and again, loudly and as convincingly as we can, that in this system we are rendered ignorant now, and that unfairly because we're not, and it's unnecessarily because we can have something like deliberation to make us less ignorant. Second is to demonstrate alternatives repeatedly, multiply the number of crowd law-like alternatives to show people how there are different ways we can participate and participate in a credible way, and to institutionalize the practice. So as Mongolia had done, imagine the ability for Congress or the president to call for a deliberative poll in the United States, where you could imagine 5 of them running simultaneously, addressing some question. And the end of that, you compare the results from 5 of them. And if they all agree, I guarantee you the public would be deeply persuaded by the fact that these 5 separately constituted bodies have come to the same conclusion. Okay, one final point before we end. I think we know now, we didn't 50 years ago, but I think we know now that we can be represented well. I think we know we're not stupid, we are ignorant. But ignorance is a curable disease. And what we need is a strategy to cure it, one mini-public at a time, and then a strategy to let us speak. Thank you very much.